I'm going to attempt something here, and that is to just make a short video responding to some of the things that were brought up in the discussion. So the main things I want to concentrate on here are the ambiguity in the word rationalism and the sea change with respect to how people view materialism. Now I'm borrowing this. I know this is bad here, the resolution. I hand drew this and I couldn't find my original. I had copied this for somebody. I'm borrowing this way of presenting the information from Arthur Holmes. So I want to give credit. Basically what you're looking at here is two crisscrossing timelines. The British empirical timeline starts on the left. You can see I have it starting with Francis Bacon, somewhat arbitrary who I have it starting with, but then it moves in a kind of downward direction, but it moves to the right. The fact that it's a downward direction is indicative of nothing except that the whole point of this is so that they cross and then continue on. So it's not a value judgment like empiricism is going downhill. It's simply the way it's represented. So similarly, the continental rationalists, and I'll get into that in a minute, are moving up and to the right. But again, they start with Descartes and it moves all the way to the right. And you see I have it terminating with Jean-Paul Sartre, but I didn't draw this for this point, but I'm just using this as an illustration. The first sense of the word rationalism is basically trust in human brain power. Rationalism in that sense was thought during the Enlightenment to be saying that humans are very smart, and if we just stop looking at the world irrationally, if we stop depending on the authorities of the ancient philosophers or of the church, superstition, blah, 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 we will make big advancements in our understanding of the universe. Rationalism in that sense, Enlightenment rationalism, encompasses both the empirical and the continental rational traditions. That's a huge and important point. They're both rationalisms from the definition that I just gave, that it's this overarching trust in human brain power. But then, of course, this tradition disagrees over the proper way to structure reasoning. So yes, we trust in reasoning, we trust in human brain power, but what premises do we start with? And then there's a debate between those people, the continental rationalists, who rely on a priori methods, that is to say, methods that in general have nothing to do with checking claims in the world. An a priori argument is simply based on clear and distinct principles. That was Descartes' phrase, but in any case doesn't require an investigation into the world. We don't have to look at the world from the rationalist standpoint. An example of this would be an analytic claim. So for example, bachelors are unmarried men of marriageable age, or triangles have three sides. We don't have to make an investigation to check those claims. They're simply true by definition. If you understand the definition of a bachelor, you already know that that's an unmarried male of marriageable age. And if you know the definition of a triangle, you already know it has three sides. You don't have to check it. You don't have to make any further investigation. On the other hand, the British empirical tradition says, no, that's not right. We have to look at the world. In fact, that's the surest way to get true information, true knowledge about the world. And that method is called a posteriori because it comes after, posterior means behind or after, comes after an investigation of the world. So in that case, the way of developing human understanding is going to be to make a careful investigation of the world. And so, of course, this is where science arises, of course, right? I mean, that's the idea anyway. Baconian induction was sort of the earliest way of arguing and structuring scientific arguments and that kind of thing. Of course, as so many things are, it's more complicated than that. For one thing, René Descartes by no means excluded empirical investigation. And for another, people like John Locke, for instance, had various arguments that relied on what Descartes would refer to as an intuition. I'm borrowing these slides from another video that I did. Here, of course, you see the three great rationalists: Descartes from France, Spinoza from the Netherlands, Leibniz from Germany. And you see the three best known British empiricists: John Locke from England, Berkeley from Ireland, David Hume from Scotland. So that's where the names come from. So, but it's the second sense, right, of rationalism, the sense of a priorism. And you can kind of see that in the upper right-hand corner. a priorism. That is the sense in which rationalism is contrasted with empiricism, which would be a posteriorism. Now, another word that's in the vicinity is idealism. And here, idealism is usually contrasted with materialism. Materialism also has a bit of problem or some baggage associated with it that you should be aware of. Idealism is contrasted with materialism in the sense that materialism holds that the world is, as Blackburn writes here in his definition, entirely composed of matter. So in other words, the materialist, and I'll get into this in a moment, thinks that every existing thing can be analyzed in terms of matter. The idealist, on the other hand, was what this was contrasted with, was said, no, that's not right. There's actually a more important category of idea or spirit or mind, gets cashed out in different ways in different thinkers. But now I'm going to read from Blackburn's definition because this is the point that I was trying to make in the conversation. He writes, materialism is the view that the world is entirely composed out of matter. Now here's the next sentence. Philosophers now tend to prefer the term physicalism, since physics has shown that matter itself resolves into forces and energy and is just one amongst other physically respectable denizens of the universe. Now that's the point that I was trying to make here. Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity developed a kind of an idea whereby he thought energy was the fundamental constituent of the universe. So here we see a quote, "What we have called matter is energy, whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses." But now notice something here, because materialism basically means matterism. And going back to Blackburn, right, the view that the world is entirely composed out of matter, that's materialism. So materialism, matterism holds that every existing thing is made out of matter. But what does Einstein say? He says matter itself is made out of energy. Now that's interesting because what that means is that Einstein thought that matter could be explained in terms of, or the philosophical word is reduced to. It's a reduction. It's a form of metaphysical reductionism to say one thing is made out of another. For example, think of a herd, like a herd of whatever, cows. There's nothing, I mean plausibly, on one interpretation, there's nothing more to the herd other than the cattle. If you were going to list out everything that exists, you put rocks there and trees and so on, you wouldn't probably write herds. You would write cows, you'd write horses and dogs, but you wouldn't write herds. And the reason is because a herd isn't anything other than the cattle that make it up, the cows. So the cows exist, but a herd is simply a conglomeration of cows. In a similar way, matter, if it is simply energy, then the person who believes that isn't a materialist at all, right? Einstein wasn't a materialist. If anything, he was an energyist because he believed everything could be reduced to energy. Now, joking aside, that is what Blackburn is trying to say here with the idea that philosophers now tend to prefer the term physicalism. Because the next phrase there says, because physics has room in itself for matter, for energy. In other words, all of these categories, physics is comfortable with. Physics is comfortable talking about energy. It's not because energy is matter. It's because energy is physical. It falls under what physics studies. At least that's what the physicalists would say. That's what the physicists say. And a physicalist is a person who basically says, let's use physics as our best guide to what exists. Now, I'm not a physicalist. I'm just trying to expand your vocabulary here a little bit. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is that Einstein was an empiricist. Einstein comes out of a group of thinkers called the positivists. Now, I don't have him on this chart, but he could be added on the chart. I mean, Einstein wasn't a philosopher. He was a physicist, obviously. I'm not representing physicists on this chart. But Comte, Mach, and John Stuart Mill are probably the best representatives of this. And Ernst Mach, who was a German thinker that preceded Einstein drew heavily from him. And so, in fact, Einstein's theory of relativity is literally centered on a positivist definition of light in terms of its measurability or its observability. So think about that. The theory of relativity is based on what we can empirically know about light. It's not based on some a priori definition. It's based on what is a measurable speed of light. Einstein was an empiricist, okay? And he comes out of this Machian tradition, so to speak. Now, it's actually more complicated. The situation is more complicated than what I'm letting on, because if you look at this, and again, it's this whole British empirical trajectory, right? We're starting from Bacon and we're going all the way through. So Bacon, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Bentham, Comte, Mach, Mill, Russell, all of those people fall in a kind of a line with respect to their philosophical heritage. But Bertrand Russell, let me back up. In the past, it used to be materialists thought that everything was matter, idealists thought that everything was mind or idea, and the dualists said, oh, it's a little bit of both, right? And what that sort of came from was Descartes and Descartes' idea of substance dualism, meaning two substances, mind and body, mind and matter, whatever. By the time you get to Russell, Russell rejects this. He would also say, he's not a materialist though, he referred to his belief as neutral monism, meaning that he thought both mind and matter were both made up of some more fundamental thing, which we know not what it is, we can't define it, but he thought that it was neutral, that it had both qualities, or it could at least accommodate both material and non-material qualities. And so he called it neutral in that sense, but he believed he was a monist, but he wouldn't have accepted the label of a materialist. And by the way, John Searle, who taught for many years at the University of California at Berkeley, he also kind of picks up on that Russellian thread and extends it. But then it's even more complicated than that. I don't have on this list, but in the whole empirical kind of trajectory, there's now something called property dualism. And the property dualist says, no, there's not two substances. There's not matter and mind as two substances, but there are two properties of the mental and the material, or the body and the mind are two properties of something else. Now, a person like that could be kind of like a Bertrand Russellian monist, neutral monist, or a person could be a physicalist. I mean, a person could believe that human beings, for example, are physical beings. That does include energy, we're partly matter, but at the same time, once you get a complex enough neural system, neurology, brain, once it gets complex enough, then mental properties emerge. This would be a kind of emergentism, which is a whole nother thing in the philosophy of mine. Not to overly complicate this video, I'm going to have to sign off here. But the final point that I'll make is, and this is kind of an interesting thing, remember that the continental rationalists were a priori arguers. They argued from what Descartes called clear and distinct premises that they derived from intuition. They weren't looking at the world. They were introspecting, so to speak. The continental rationalists based what they argued primarily on the subjectivity of the thinker. But the empiricists were the ones looking out into the world. So it's interesting when you are rehearsing the discussion you had with that other gentleman, and you say you brought to his attention this scientific study and that scientific study, and here's this toddler who says this about past lives and blah, blah, blah. Notice what you're doing there is you're gesturing toward evidence of an experimental kind, of an empirical kind. In other words, that trajectory you're on is still an empirical trajectory. It's not a rationalist trajectory, at least not in the sense of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and so on. You could be sympathetic to idealism, but remember, so was George Berkeley, and Berkeley's right there between Locke and Hume on the timeline. Berkeley was an empiricist who was also an idealist. So there's no forced march between being an empiricist and being a materialist, nor is there a forced march between being an empiricist and being a physicalist, which is, again, I want to emphasize, and if you want a better authority than just me, here's Blackburn in what is really a standard reference, the Dictionary of Philosophy published by Oxford, and he writes, of course, philosophers now prefer the term physicalism. So really the only people talking about materialism anymore are people who are talking about the history of the Enlightenment. Possibly they might apply it to Greek atomism, as he mentions here. That would be Democritus and Lucretius and so on. But for the most part, no one today calls their view materialism. Even somebody like Quine. Let me see if I have Quine on here. Nope, I don't. But Quine would basically fit down as you follow Wittgenstein and go into the logical positivists. WVO, Willard von Orman Quine, would be further even down to the lower right-hand portion of the page, not on here. And he is definitely an empiricist. I mean, his whole sort of shtick is something called naturalized epistemology, where he thinks that philosophy is actually a subcategory of psychology, which is a whole other issue. Quine even says he's not a physical, I mean, he's dead now, but he used to deny being a physicalist. So think about that. And the thing is, if you look at him, you think, he doesn't believe in God. He didn't believe in the soul. So in what sense is he not a physicalist? And the answer that he gave was that he believes in things like sets and numbers. And so he thought he wasn't a physicalist because he believes in numbers. It gets a bit complicated, and I think the person you were talking to is obviously a bit philosophically naive if they were arguing in terms of these old categories. So anyway, this is just a short video to kind of make you aware of some of the terminology.